The Notebook That Shouldn't Exist. Prologue, Richmond, Virginia, July 2025. The basement archives of the Virginia Historical Society had the air of a sealed crypt, paper, mildew, iron, and something like old rain trapped inside stone. The fluorescent lights hummed with a tired insistence, turning every aisle into a tunnel and every shelf into a row of sleeping teeth. Dr. Elena Vasquez wiped sweat from her brow and leaned over a crate stenciled in flaking black ink. Confederate Miscellaneous, 1863. Uncatalogued. Uncatalogued meant 100 things, most of them harmless. Donations someone never processed, boxes mislabeled decades ago, a curator's backlog. But it also meant the absence of witnesses, the kind of absence that could swallow a career if it turned out she'd mishandled something important. Elena needed something important. Her grant was thinning. Her tenure review had the feeling of a clock you could hear even when you tried not to. She had been chasing rumors about Lee's lost dispatches for months. Half scholarship, half obsession, and one part desperation. The crate offered her the usual: brittle maps of Chancellorsville, requisition slips, ink-faded lists of boots and bandages. Routine. Dead. Then at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with frayed twine, she found a small leather notebook, no bigger than a man's palm. The cover bore faint embossed initials. JRM, a Confederate seal stamped in gold, faded but unmistakable. No accession number, no donor record. Elena's pulse tightened. How does an object sit in a public archive for over a century with no paper trail? She opened it under the dim light. The pages were filled with meticulous handwriting and a dense mesh of symbols, Greek letters braided with Roman numerals, stars marking certain lines. Dates clustered like bruises around Gettysburg, June 30th, July 1st, 1863. It wasn't a battle log. It wasn't orders. It read like mathematics pretending to be language. A loose sheet slipped from between pages. A sketch of a Union fort at Harper's Ferry, annotated with troop movements that did not match any known dispatch. Elena photographed each page with her phone, careful, methodical, trying to keep her breathing even. The final entry, dated July 4th, after Pickett's charge failed, stopped her cold. The eagle's shadow falls. Trust no courier. Deliver to EW at the Raven's Nest or all is lost. Cipher key. Blood of the first. Burn after reading. JRM. The Raven's Nest rang a bell. An old wartime safe house outside Front Royal, the kind of place locals pointed at and lowered their voices. EW could be anyone, if you ignored the fact that initials were often all that remained when someone wanted names to disappear. She closed the notebook and slipped it into her bag. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she'd report it in the morning after she'd confirmed what she had, after she could protect it from being quietly buried again. That night, thunder rolled over Richmond like distant guns. Elena spread her photos on her laptop and tried a basic substitution, expecting nothing. Something yielded too quickly. The symbols aligned into a fragment of plain English that made her stomach clench. The Union snake coils within, coordinates enclosed. Strike at dawn, July 5th. Coordinates, Pennsylvania farmland, miles from the battlefield. Not strategy, not Gettysburg. Something else, something hidden. A knock rattled her door. 3 sharp hits, a pause, then 2 more. Almost polite. Elena froze. Through the peephole she saw 2 men in dark suits, badges catching the hallway light. "Dr. Vasquez," one of them called, voice controlled. "FBI, we need to speak with you about a notebook removed from the Virginia archives today." "How did they know? Why the FBI?" Elena backed away, the notebook in her bag suddenly heavy in a way paper shouldn't be. Whatever JRM had written wasn't only history. It was a live wire. Chania, Part 1, Salem, Massachusetts, October 2025. The morning in Salem had that bone-deep cold that crept through wool and pretended it belonged. Dr. Eleanor Hale, Nora to colleagues who had earned the privilege, pulled her coat tighter as her Subaru rolled down an overgrown gravel drive. Ahead, the Hawthorne estate leaned into the gray, a salt box house from the late 17th century that had survived too long to feel like a building. It felt like a witness, blackened clapboard, windows like blank eyes, and a widow's walk perched on the roof where legends said Judge Jonathan Hawthorne's wife once watched the hangings. Nora had been hired to catalog the Hawthorne family archives before the property was sold. The owner, Lydia Hawthorne, had sounded amused and tired over the phone. "Family history matters," Lydia had said, "especially ours. Secrets have a way of surfacing." The door creaked open before Nora could knock. Lydia Hawthorne stood there, a wisp of a woman in her 90s, silver hair pinned loosely, eyes sharp behind thick glasses. She looked like someone who had outlived several versions of the world and hadn't liked any of them. "Dr. Hale," Lydia said, "come in, before the ghosts get curious." Nora smiled despite herself and stepped into the foyer, past portraits of Hawthornes whose faces wore the expression of people convinced they were right. The air smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic beneath it, like a penny held too long in a closed fist. "The real stories are in the attic," Lydia muttered as they climbed. "My father sealed it in '68 after finding something. Told me never to go up there again. Now the house will be gutted by developers, and I refuse to let them bulldoze our sins without at least labeling the boxes." The attic door was padlocked. Lydia's hand trembled only slightly as she lifted a key from a chain around her neck and turned it. The lock popped open with a reluctant click. When Lydia swung the door wide, dust billowed outward, and Nora's flashlight beam cut through cobwebs thick as veils. Trunks lined the walls, labeled in faded ink. Hawthorne ledgers, 1690-1700, personal effects, J.H. correspondence, forbidden. In the center sat a sea chest with its lid ajar, as if it had been interrupted, mid-opening and never forgiven whoever had stopped. "Start wherever," Lydia said, lowering herself into a moth-eaten armchair. "I'll be down for tea. Shout if you unearth any pitchforks." Nora began the way she always did. Gloves, photos, notes, the slow, respectful handling of paper that had survived more than anyone alive. Trial transcripts, property ledgers, lists of confiscations disguised as righteous accounting. Then she found an entry that did not belong. 1692, Octmel, 12. Inheritance from E. Putnam, 1 infant, unmarked. Value, incalculable. An infant, unmarked. Value, incalculable. The Putnams had been major accusers in the trials, and their records were a maze, but there was no known infant in any documented lineage that year. Nora cross-referenced on her tablet. Nothing. She went deeper. Letters tied with twine. A plea from Monsieur Corey in a shaking hand. Mercy that never came. Tucked between them, a small leather journal, not Judge Hawthorne's, initialed E.H., and on its inside cover, drawn carefully as if the ink itself mattered, was a symbol Nora had not seen in standard Salem materials. A horned circle with the silhouette of a child inside. Nora's throat tightened. Symbols were rarely random. Symbols repeated meant intention. She opened the journal. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, dated 1693. The child came in the night, pale as moonlight, eyes like embers. They call her spectral, but she is flesh. Jay insists on secrecy. The trials rage, and she bears the mark. If discovered, we burn with her. A child, hidden, a mark. Entries continued, each one pulling the story away from courtroom hysteria and into something colder. The girl was named Abigail. But not the Abigail everyone knew from textbooks. This one lived in shadows, not in affidavits. She speaks in tongues, predicts storms. The servants whisper of the devil's get. Jay has hidden her in the cellar, away from the hangings. Nora photographed every page, her academic skepticism struggling against the simple physical reaction of her skin prickling. Then a later entry. Abigail grows swift, unnaturally so. 5 years old, yet strong as a lad of 10. She drew blood from the cat with a glance. Jay fears her now, speaks of exorcism. Sketches filled the margins. A pale girl, elongated shadows, eyes glowing, and always the same horned circle. Under a bundle of cloth, Nora found a child's dress, stained dark in a way that could have been ink or age, or something worse. A locket engraved with the symbol. A hand-drawn map of the Salem woods, marked Sanctum, Do Not Approach. When Lydia returned with tea and saw the symbol, her amusement slipped like a mask. "That mark," Lydia said softly. "My father used to draw it in the margins of his notebooks. He'd do it without noticing, like a nervous habit." Nora kept her voice careful. "Did he ever say where he learned it?" Lydia's jaw worked. "He said our family had debts. He said some debts were older than the country." Nora turned to the final entry in Eliza Hawthorne's journal. The handwriting tightened, as if the pen had been held by someone trying not to shake. "The blood moon rises. Abigail calls to the old ones. We must end it, or it ends us. Jay prepares the rite." Outside, wind pushed against the house, and the widow's walk groaned as if someone stepped there. Nora checked her phone. No signal. Salem had plenty of dead zones, but it felt like this house was creating one. Lydia watched her. "You can go if you want," she said too casually. "The roads flood this time of year. But you can go." Nora should have said yes. Instead, she said, "I'll stay." Part 2. The message that wasn't there. In the guest room, Nora uploaded her photos and searched the symbol in every database she trusted, then in the ones she didn't. A few occult forums mentioned something similar. Binding mark, child seal, the first, a jumble of indigenous references and Puritan fear stitched together by amateurs. Nothing solid. Then just after midnight, a sound carried through the house. Soft laughter. A child's laughter, thin and pleased, as if it belonged to someone playing a game alone. Nora sat up, heart pounding. The attic padlock, she realized, should still be closed. Lydia had taken the key back. Nora's flashlight beam cut the hallway. She climbed the stairs on feet that tried to step quietly and failed. At the attic door, the padlock hung open. Not unlocked, not broken. Open, as if it had been unlatched from the inside. The journal lay on the floor, splayed open like a mouth. A page that had been blank earlier was now filled with fresh ink, dark and wet enough to shine. "Nora, you seek what hunts. The blood moon wakes me. Join or flee. Nora's name." In a journal last written in the 17th century. Her skin went cold in a way heat couldn't fix. Footsteps sounded downstairs, small, quick, bare, not Lydia's. Lydia's voice drifted up, shaking. "Dr. Hale, something's in the cellar." Nora's body moved before her mind finished arguing with itself. She grabbed the locket with the symbol. She didn't know why, only that she couldn't leave it behind. And went down. Part 3. The cellar. Beneath the cellar. The cellar stairs descended into a darkness that ate the edges of her flashlight beam. The air changed with each step. Colder, wetter, and laced with the metallic smell of rust, and something organic beneath it, like turned earth and old blood. "Lydia!" Nora called, keeping her voice low. "I'm here," Lydia answered from above the stairs, not coming down. "Father said, Never to go down after dark. But I heard something move. At the bottom, the cellar opened into a stone chamber, older than the house itself. Wine racks stood empty like ribs. Barrels slumped in corners, and on the far wall, half hidden by shadows, was a doorway bricked shut. Around the bricks, the horned circle symbol had been drawn in chalk. Or, not chalk. Not when Nora leaned closer and smelled it. Dried blood had a smell, faint but unmistakable if you'd ever cut your hand and let it sit too long. The bricks were disturbingly new, the mortar clean in places, as if the wall had been disturbed within years, maybe months. Someone had sealed it recently, or resealed it. Nora photographed the symbol and pressed her fingers to the mortar. It crumbled too easily. A weak seal. A seal designed to be broken. She found a rusted crowbar on a hook, too convenient, and worked the bricks loose. Dust coated her tongue. Her knuckles split on a sharp edge and bled, and when her blood hit the floor, it looked for a second as if it shone. That was the moment. Nora understood the house was not merely old. It was attentive. She widened a gap and peered through. Beyond was a narrow passage and a sound like breathing, rhythmic, patient. Nora squeezed through, coat snagging on brick. On the other side, stone steps descended again. A cellar beneath the cellar. Not part of any blueprint, not part of any rational story. As she went down, the walls changed, carved deliberately, covered in symbols. Some she recognized as warding marks. Others made her eyes slide away as if her brain refused to hold their shapes. The passage opened into a chamber that stole her breath. A sanctuary, an underground temple preserved as if time had been turned away at the threshold. A stone altar sat in the center. Above it hung paintings, crude at first, then increasingly refined, depicting Salem's trials as something other than hysteria. In the paintings, the hanged did not simply die. They changed. Bodies becoming luminous, shadows unfolding like wings, the crowd below fleeing in terror. And in every scene, a pale child with auburn hair stood at the center, small hands lifted as if conducting. Abigail. On the altar lay a leather journal far older than Eliza Hawthorne's. When Nora opened it, the handwriting was Eliza's, but frantic, as if pressed into the page by violence. March 1692. The child arrived 3 days before the first accusations. She came through the forest at midnight, and I knew. The mark upon her brow, the symbol that cannot be unseen. Jonathan denies it, calls me mad, but he feels it too. The wrongness, the hunger. She does not eat. She does not sleep. She watches, always watching. The afflicted girls began their fits the next morning. They blame witches, but I know the truth. She called them, the child called them, and they answered because her hunger demands blood. Nora turned pages with hands that refused to stop shaking. The sanctuary was here before Salem, before the colony. The Agawam built it not for worship, for containment. The symbol is a binding mark. It holds her to flesh. Without it, she would ascend. Without it, she would consume everything. Another entry, different handwriting. Jonathan Hawthorne's, the same as the trial documents upstairs. Eliza is gone. She took the child and fled. I do not know if she intended mercy or damnation. Perhaps there is no difference. The mark will hold for now. The binding will hold for now. But blood calls to blood, and some debts are eternal. A final entry, dated 1710. I am dying. The mark upon my brow grows darker. When I cross, the binding weakens. In 50 years, perhaps 70, she will wake again. Someone always answers. Footsteps sounded behind Nora. She whirled, flashlight up. Lydia stood at the edge of the chamber, pale as paper. "No," Lydia whispered, eyes wide. "No, he said he sealed it. He promised." "Who?" Nora demanded, though she already knew. "Lydia." "What is Abigail?" Lydia's mouth trembled. My father called her the daughter, a thing that shouldn't exist, something between. Thunder rolled overhead and the symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, a sick phosphorescence that made Nora's eyes water. A child's voice began to sing in a language Nora didn't recognize, and the paintings shifted. Not much, just enough to prove the figures inside were turning their heads. Looking at her. She's here, Lydia breathed. It's the blood moon tonight. Father wrote. He wrote. Before Lydia could finish, the air in the chamber shimmered as if heat rose from stone. A shape formed. A girl, 7 or 8 at first, pale skin, auburn hair, then older in a blink, as though the idea of her age was optional. Her eyes were the color of amber held to light. Behind them was something ancient and vast and deeply, terribly sad. Thank you, the girl said, voice soft as wind through dry leaves. Finally, someone listens. Nora's knees wanted to fold. You're Abigail, Nora managed. The girl tilted her head. That is the name they gave me. It is not the first name I have worn. Lydia's breath hitched. Aunt, Abigail smiled, and the smile was wrong in a way that made Nora's stomach turn. Not monstrous, not theatrical. Just slightly too certain of itself. You have grown old, Lydia, Abigail said kindly, as if commenting on weather. Time touches you so quickly. What do you want? Nora forced out. Abigail stepped closer. The symbols along her wrist glowed faintly. The horned circle burned into flesh like a brand. What I have always wanted, she said. To be real in the world that denied me. To be acknowledged. To be written into the record that erased me. Nora's throat tightened. You orchestrated the trials. I orchestrated hunger, Abigail said, and her voice remained gentle. The trials were how your people chose to feed it. They needed witches. They needed stories. And blood is persuasive. Nora felt the air pressure change, as if the chamber itself inhaled. The blood moon rises at midnight, Abigail continued. Tonight the veil thins fully. The first press against it. They want the gate. The old ones, Lydia whispered, trembling. Abigail looked up, as if listening to something above the stone ceiling. They are not old to themselves. They are simply the first. They existed here when your names did not. Nora's mind raced through everything she'd read. Every hint of blood of the first in Eliza's writing, and something else snapped into place with the sick clarity of a nightmare. Blood of the first, Nora said slowly. That phrase, Abigail's eyes flicked to her. You have heard it. Nora's mouth went dry. Where? The chamber lights, if they could be called lights, pulsed. Abigail smiled again. Not here, she said. Not yet. Then she raised her hand and the world tilted. Nora's lungs compressed as if someone squeezed her ribs from inside. Her flashlight flickered. The paintings rippled like water. You will document, Abigail said, voice still soft, still almost reasonable. You will tell, and if you do not, Salem will suffer until your words learn obedience. The pressure vanished. Nora gasped. Abigail turned toward the steps leading up and spoke without looking back. You have until midnight to decide, Nora. Join or flee. Bind me, if you can. She paused, but understand. Binding is not mercy. It is a different kind of cage. She ascended, and the stone passage behind her shuddered. A padlock snapped shut somewhere above. Impossible. Final. They were trapped. Part 4. The second thread. Richmond. At 11:12 p.m., hundreds of miles away, Elena Vasquez sat in a windowless interview room that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. The 2 FBI agents across from her had the calm of people who believed panic was useful only in other people. One slid a folder across the table. Inside was a photocopy of Elena's own phone photographs, pages from JRM's notebook. Elena's blood went cold. "How did you get—" "We've been monitoring the archive's camera feeds," the agent said. "We also monitor certain keywords when they appear in digitized materials. Raven's nest. Blood of the first. The symbol!" He turned a page and exposed a photograph of the horned circle, sketched in the Confederate notebook. Elena stared. It was the same mark she'd seen. No, she hadn't seen it. She hadn't known it existed until now. Yet looking at it made her eyes ache, as if her brain tried to reject its geometry. "That symbol appears in multiple historical contexts," the second agent said. "Salem, Front Royal, Gettysburg, coastal Massachusetts, indigenous sites predating European settlement." Elena swallowed. Why would Confederate dispatches share symbols with Salem Witch Trials? The first agent's gaze sharpened. Because some things do not belong to one era, some things recur. He slid another document forward, a printed email thread. Dr. Eleanor Nora, Hale, Hawthorne Estate Archive contract. Elena's breath caught. "Who is she?" "A consultant," the agent said. "And tonight she's in a house with a history of, let's call it, anomalies." Elena leaned forward. "You're watching her?" "We were," the agent said. "Then we lost signal from the property." He tapped Elena's notebook photos. "We believe JRM wasn't writing about troop movements. We believe he was writing about a containment failure, a breach." Elena's voice came out thin. "And you want me to, what? Help you interpret a Civil War cipher to stop a breach in Salem?" The agent shared a glance that contained too much agreement. "You opened the notebook," the second said. "That matters." Elena felt suddenly certain of something she couldn't justify, that by photographing those pages she had become part of the story, whether she wanted to or not. "We're taking you to Massachusetts," the first agent said. "Now." Part 5. The Book That Hurts to Read. Back beneath the Hawthorne house, Nora forced herself to breathe and think like a scholar instead of pray. There was no signal, no way to call anyone. The house above them vibrated with a low, steady thrum, like a distant generator. Except it wasn't mechanical. It felt biological. Lydia sat on the stone floor, pressed against a wall covered in symbols. "She'll kill us," Lydia whispered. "She'll kill everyone." "Not if we stop her," Nora said. Not because she believed it, but because Lydia needed someone to say it. Nora searched the chamber with a sharper eye. At the far end was a circular alcove whose walls were carved entirely with the horned circle symbol, repeated so many times the stone had been worn smooth. In its center sat an altar. On it, a human skull, ancient, etched with the symbol, and beside it, a leather-bound book that looked too old to be paper. The binding, Nora realized with a slow horror, looked like skin. "Don't touch it," Lydia said, voice cracking. "Father said," but Nora was already reaching out. The compulsion was terrible, intimate, like a hand at the base of her skull, guiding her forward. The book opened with a sound like dry leaves. The text was in layers. Old English, Latin, and a third script that made Nora's eyes water as if she were staring into sunlight. She shouldn't have been able to understand it. But as she read, the meaning forced itself into her mind, like a splinter. The first children, beings predating human settlement, woven into land and forest and water. A compact, a binding performed in 1692 to reinforce a veil between worlds. A failure. The book described how Judge Hawthorne and other magistrates used the witch trials as cover for a larger working, spilling righteous blood to strengthen containment. But one of the accused, Elizabeth Hutchinson, a name Nora recognized only faintly from obscure records, had been pregnant. Not with a normal child, with a conduit. When she died, the binding weakened. When Abigail was born beneath a blood moon, it cracked. Abigail was not simply a demon or a witch. She was a key, a living hinge between worlds. And every cycle of the blood moon, she woke more fully. The book did not offer comfort. It offered a method. 3 components to seal the gate. 1. Blood of the bloodline that built the binding, Hawthorne blood. 2. Blood of the key, Abigail's blood. 3. The will of one who has touched both worlds and remains human. A witness, a scribe, a mind capable of holding the words without shattering. Nora's stomach turned. It means you, Lydia whispered. Nora closed the book, hands shaking. We need her blood. Lydia laughed once, short and broken. How do we get close enough? Above them, the house groaned. Somewhere up there, a child's voice hummed a tune that made the cymbals glow brighter. Nora looked at the crowbar near the broken brick seal, then at the knife Lydia had tucked into her cardigan pocket. An old habit of women who'd lived through too much. We get out, Nora said. We interrupt whatever she's doing before midnight. And if we fail, Nora thought of the message written in fresh ink. Join or flee. I don't think flee is real, Nora said quietly. I think it's a kindness she pretends to offer. They found the passage Nora had missed earlier, an angled tunnel that rose and narrowed, carved like an afterthought. It led into the house's basement, behind a shelf that slid aside with disturbing ease, as if the house wanted them to take this route. The Hawthorne estate above was dark, not asleep, waiting. Chanting drifted from upstairs, thin as thread, pulled tight. The attic. Nora and Lydia moved through rooms that felt subtly wrong. Doorways too tall, angles slightly off, shadows leaning toward them. At the staircase, Nora stopped. The steps were no longer normal wood. They twisted into a spiral of shadow and light that hurt the eye, impossible geometry folding inward like a throat. Lydia's hand trembled in Nora's. This isn't. It's a path, Nora said, forcing her feet onto it. That's all it is. A path. They climbed. Part 6. The Right. The attic had become a circle that could not fit inside the house. The trunks and boxes were gone. In their place, a vast curved space whose walls were covered in the horned circle symbol, glowing amber and green, pulsing like a heartbeat. At the center stood Abigail. She looked 17 now, old enough to speak with certainty, young enough to weaponize innocence. Her auburn hair floated as if underwater. Shadows moved around her in shapes Nora's mind refused to complete. Around the circle, half visible, were other forms, angles and limbs that did not belong to this world. Pressing through like fingers under stretched fabric. The first. Abigail did not turn, as Nora and Lydia stepped forward. You came, she said, pleased. How brave, how predictable. No, Nora said, voice shaking but present. We came to stop you. Abigail laughed softly. Stop me, scholar. I am the bridge. I am the key. I am the wound you call history. Nora opened the skin-bound book. The words in the painful script sparked behind her eyes. She spoke the first binding word. The attic convulsed. For a heartbeat, Nora saw 2 places at once. The dusty attic and a different world. A forest without stars. Stone cities that grew like coral. A sky that felt like a lid. The half-visible beings shrieked, a sound that rattled glass throughout the house. Abigail's head snapped toward Nora. What have you done? What you forced me to learn, Nora said, and spoke the second word. Lydia stepped forward, knife in hand, and cut her palm. Her blood fell to the floor and glowed as it hit the symbols, forming a partial circle. For my family, Lydia whispered. For everyone you used. Abigail's face flickered. human to something else and back. "You don't understand," she hissed. "They will never stop pressing. I am only honest about it." Nora cut her own palm. The pain grounded her. Her blood joined Lydia's, brightening the circle. Abigail moved like a striking animal, lunging. Nora spoke the third word. Chains of light erupted from the floor, snapping around Abigail's limbs. She screamed, not from pain but from rage at being constrained. "You could have been more than this," Abigail shouted at Nora. "I offered you knowledge. I offered you duration. You offered me a cage with prettier bars," Nora said, voice raw. Abigail thrashed. The shadows around her roiled, and the half-visible beings pressed closer, desperate. Nora forced herself to meet Abigail's eyes. In them was something Nora hadn't expected to recognize. Loneliness so old it had become hunger. For a single, dangerous moment, Nora saw the tragedy inside the monster, an unwanted conduit, born between worlds, treated as proof and weapon and mistake. Then the moment passed, drowned by the attic's pressure and the approaching midnight. "We need her blood," Nora whispered to Lydia. Lydia's hand shook. "I can't." Nora stepped forward, ignoring fear, ignoring the part of her mind that begged for distance. She held up the locket engraved with the horned circle. Abigail's eyes snapped to it. An involuntary reaction, like a reflex. "Give that to me," Abigail said softly. "That belonged to Eliza." "It belongs to history," Nora said, and drove the edge of the locket's broken hinge across Abigail's wrist. A thin line of blood welled, dark, impossibly bright in the pulsing light. It hit the binding circle and flared. The attic screamed. Not Abigail. The house. The symbols blazed. The half-visible beings shrieked in unison, as if the circle had become a mouth biting down. Nora spoke the fourth and final word. The chains tightened. Abigail's body flickered rapidly. Child, teen, something ancient, something inhuman, a silhouette inside a horned circle. Her voice broke, suddenly smaller. "I don't want to go back into the dark." Nora's throat tightened. "Then you shouldn't have tried to bring the dark here." Light flooded the attic. Not warm, not holy, simply final. The half-visible beings dissolved, dragged backward as though pulled through a slit that closed behind them. Abigail convulsed, eyes wide, mouth forming a sound that never became language. And then she was gone. The glowing symbols dimmed. The attic snapped back into ordinary dimensions like a room exhaling. Trunks reappeared, cobwebs, dust, boxes. The house shuddered, not collapsing but settling, as if a knot had been tightened inside it for centuries and had finally been cinched closed. Nora grabbed Lydia's hand. They ran. Part 7. Arrival too late. When Nora and Lydia stumbled out onto the gravel drive, the sky over Salem had cleared enough to reveal the blood moon cresting the horizon, full, red, and indifferent. For a terrible second, Nora expected the world to split anyway. It didn't. The moon hung there like an eye that had decided to blink. Police arrived fast, faster than they should have, sirens threading the quiet roads, and then black SUVs, men in dark jackets and purposeful silence. An agent approached, holding up a badge as if it were a ritual object. "Dr. Hale." Nora's mouth went dry. "Who are you?" "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, and then more quietly. "But not the part you think." Another SUV door opened. A woman stepped out. Dark hair pulled back, eyes too tired for her age. Elena Vasquez. Nora stared. "You! Who are you?" Elena looked like someone who had been running through a storm and hadn't stopped when she reached shelter. "I'm the reason they came," she said. "Or the notebook is. I'm not sure which." The agent's gaze shifted between them. "It's contained," he said, as if confirming a measurement. Nora glanced back at the house. For now. Elena's eyes sharpened. You've seen the symbol. Nora hesitated. Yes. Elena opened a folder and showed Nora a photograph. An 1863 notebook page with the horned circle symbol drawn in the margin. Under it, in neat script, a phrase, "Blood of the First." Nora felt the floor tilt again, very slightly. So it wasn't just Salem. Elena shook her head. It's never just one place. The agent's voice was careful. We'll need statements, evidence, everything you photographed. Nora almost laughed. You think you can put this in a file? The agent didn't smile. We do. That's our job. We file what we can't destroy. Lydia made a quiet sound. A half sob, half bitter laugh. My father tried to destroy it, she whispered. It didn't help. Elena looked at Nora with something like grim recognition. You bound it, she said, but you didn't erase it. Nora thought of Abigail's last plea. I don't want to go back into the dark, and of the way the house had felt attentive, hungry for story. No, Nora agreed. I didn't. Part 8. What they told the world. In the weeks that followed, the Hawthorne estate was condemned. Engineers cited structural unsoundness, mold, foundation issues. Unsafe for occupancy. The official story was dull enough to satisfy everyone who demanded a reason, and cheap enough to satisfy everyone who didn't. Nora published her findings carefully. Trial documents, ledgers, Eliza Hawthorne's journal, evidence of corruption and cruelty, of property seizures disguised as morality. Historians praised the work. Newspapers ran polite features about new insight into Salem's hysteria. No one printed the pages with the symbol. No one published the message, written in fresh ink, 300 years after the journal's last entry. Nora kept those in a separate drive, encrypted, air-gapped, buried in redundancy. Not out of paranoia, out of respect for the fact that some knowledge behaved like a door. Lydia lived 5 more years. She spent them helping Nora organize the Hawthorne papers, with a calm that felt earned. When she died, it was quiet, and her last words to Nora were, "Thank you for knowing when to speak and when to stay silent." Nora carried that silence like a second spine. Elena returned to Richmond, but the FBI's shadow did not leave her life. She was approached, invited, gently threatened, recruited, depending on the day, into a small network of scholars and analysts who studied recurring patterns. Symbols that appeared across centuries. Locations where history bent in ways it couldn't explain. Events that looked like mass delusion until they didn't. Elena never got her clean tenure packet. She got something else, a classification stamp and the knowledge that the past was not passive. It watched back. Epilogue. 10 years later. 10 years after the Hawthorne night, Nora stood in the National Museum of American History beside a display she'd helped curate. Documents from the Salem trials, artifacts excavated from the Hawthorne property. A sober explanation of how fear and authority could turn a community into a weapon. Visitors drifted past, reading plaques, nodding solemnly. None of them knew what had nearly opened under a blood moon. None of them saw the symbol in its truest form, because Nora had ensured it was never printed cleanly, never rendered precisely. She learned early that accuracy wasn't always virtue. As the museum lights reflected in the glass, Nora caught a movement beside her in the reflection. A teenage girl, auburn hair, amber eyes. For a heartbeat, Abigail stood there, still, watching, not threatening, not pleading, simply present. Nora turned. There was only a family with a stroller, an elderly couple, a docent pointing at a date. When Nora looked back at the glass, the reflection was only her own. But the air felt slightly colder. That night, her phone buzzed with a message from Elena. A photo attachment. A notebook page, A Civil War cipher line, newly found in a box that had supposedly been emptied decades ago. Under the familiar symbol were words that made Nora's stomach drop. The binding holds until someone listens too well. Nora stared at the screen until the museum lights outside her apartment blurred into halos. She thought of blood moons, of cycles measured in decades and centuries, of beings that did not experience time as a straight line. She thought of Abigail's loneliness and the way loneliness could become a lever if it lasted long enough. And she thought of the first message written in fresh ink. Join or flee. Maybe it had never been a choice. Maybe it had been a prediction. Nora locked her phone, drew her coat tighter, and walked faster through Washington's dark streets, already making lists in her head. Students to mentor, archives to watch, symbols to keep out of the wrong hands. History, she understood now, wasn't only what happened. It was what was contained, and containment was never permanent. Not really.